So this is a really quick project, and it's just intended as a demonstration for how to do a handful of quick skills using Python, Flask, SQLite, and wrapping all this together into a web application front end. So what we're going to end up with is just something that looks roughly like this. Yours will include some different data. Assuming that you follow along with the instructions, you'll have the capacity to view all of the data straight out of a database, and you can add some students via a form. It will incorporate some code. We're going to be doing that using PyCharm. This is just going to be using the PyCharm Professional. So I'll try that again using the PyCharm Community Edition. If you use the Professional, all of this will work exactly the same. In fact, it'll probably be a little bit easier. Like I said before, it will just use a SQLite 3 here in order for you to be connecting to a backend database. So let's just stop this and go right back to the start, and we'll have a look at how we go about doing this. So I'm going to assume that you're using some form of IDE such as PyCharm or Visual Studio Code. You can get by with any one of these or really any of the other IDEs that are around. Here within PyCharm, I'm going to hit Create New Project. I'm going to make sure that I give this a meaningful name, and I'm going to call this student_ms, which is student management system. It's just going to store just some basic details regarding students. Now, if you're using a different IDE, you may need to go and create a virtual environment manually yourself afterwards. PyCharm, and including PyCharm Community, is polite enough to do that for us. I'm using Python 3.7, just given the particular date here, but if you're using a later iteration, such as 3.8, which is already out, that should all work equally fine. I'm going to hit Create here, and then just patiently give it a chance to go and create its stuff. So that took about 30 seconds to create, and hopefully you'll end up with a screen that looks a little bit like that. It may or may not be just entirely closed. You may have a project file over here. Again, if you're using something different such as Visual Studio Code, it might end up looking different again. Just some basics here for you to know is within this Project Explorer up here, this is where we're going to be spending our time creating our files and our various .py files or HTML files we're going to be using. This is going to be our coding window that we use, and down here we have access to our terminal. So the first thing that we're going to do is install our various dependencies, and there's really only one that we need to worry about at the moment, and that is Flask. So Flask is a web application micro framework that we use to create web applications. If you're comfortable using the terminal down here, it should just be as simple as saying pip install Flask. So if I were to hit enter there, it should go and install all that for me. I'm just going to backspace it though briefly, because I just wanted to show you as well here within PyCharm, if you go File Settings, and then find along the left-hand side here the name of your project, Project Student MS, drop that down and go and find Python Interpreter. This is PyCharm's built-in package manager. So I'm going to hit plus up here to install. I'm going to search for Flask, and then I'm going to hit Install Package. So if you don't have access to the terminal, or if you're uncomfortable with it, you can just install it that way as well, as long as you're within PyCharm. But it's also a good idea wherever you can to get used to using the terminal. So it will look like not much has really happened at that stage, but you'll see that Flask is going to be installed in here within our packages, Ginger2, a whole stack of other stuff here that leads into Flask within our virtual environment. Again, make sure if you're uncertain, you should be able to create your own virtual environment here as well. So we'll start off just by creating our database. This is going to be the first logical step. We're going to right click on the parent folder up here. So this is student MS, not the virtual environment, just take note of that. Right click on that and go new Python file. And I'm going to create a file here called db-create. This is just going to be, like I said before, a basic Python file, and we're going to use this to create the database and the tables. To create and connect to a SQLite database within PyCharm, we first need to import SQLite 3, and then we also need to build a connection. So we're going to call our connection Connie, and we're going to create SQLite 3, and we want to connect to a database, and we're just going to call this students.db. Beneath this, I'm going to create a cursor, and think of a cursor command as like when you open up Excel and there's a particular cell that you click in and you use your cursor to provide different commands. Right? This is the thing that you use in order to do stuff. I'm going to give myself a bit of space here, and I'm going to say connie.commit, and open bracket, close bracket. I'm going to say connie.close. So this is a really basic starter. All it's done is it's going to create a connection here to a database. Now you'll notice that this database file, we actually haven't gone about creating that at all. SQLite 3 is polite enough to, whenever you say, hey, connect to a database, if one isn't there, it's going to create one for you. We then declare a cursor that we don't use just yet. We then commit, so this is say, hey, make any changes that we've made to our database, commit them to the database, and then close the connection here. So see that if I now go right click, run, you'll see that it doesn't look like anything's happened here. It gives me, hey, finish with exit code 0. But on the left-hand side here, you'll see that I now have a students.db. So it's gone about creating our database. It's important to note there that if there's no connection, if there's no file listed here that actually already exists, it will create one for you. So if you accidentally type the wrong thing here, if you've got multiple connections, you may end up creating multiple databases. To get around that, what we're going to do now is we're going to create a new variable called dblocale, and this is going to be students.db. And I'm going to ditch this stuff in here within this bracket, and I'm going to make this dblocale. Now, why bother doing this? Well, later on, if I have multiple connections and multiple cursor commands and whatnot happening all within the same file here, each time I go about typing students.db, it's every likelihood that I'm going to stuff it up at least once. I might call it student, I might call it students, and it will mean that it won't work because it might create a fresh database here with nothing in it. So it's worthwhile just specifying, hey, this dblocale, that's the variable that we're going to use here. This should work just exactly the same as before. If I go right-click run, you'll see that it doesn't do anything because we haven't provided it with any instructions yet. Now I'm going to assume at this stage that you are a little bit comfortable with using SQLite, and therefore some basic commands will make sense to you. To create a basic command within SQLite, we use our cursor here with this method execute. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside this bracket and I'm going to add 3 exclamation marks, not exclamation marks, apologies, 3 double quotation marks. I'm going to skip this onto a different line. This is me telling SQLite, or Python really, PyCharm, that hey, we're going to be creating a multi-line instruction here. So just bear that in mind. So what we want to do is we want to now create a table, and we're just going to call this students. In fact, we won't call it students for now. That's actually a terrible idea, because then we'll have a table inside a database. The database is called students and the table is called students. Things will get complicated. We're just going to start off by creating contact details here. Now within that, we want to add some information within some brackets here. Now because we have our 3 quotation marks here, we can put this across multiple lines. So I'm just going to separate this out just to make it a little bit more readable for us. So what I want to do is I want to start off by creating a column here called integer. It's going to be a primary key, and I want it to auto increment. As well as that, I want to create a field called first name. I want another field called text. I want another field name called street address, which is also text, and I want a suburb, also text here. So this is just basic SQLite instructions here to go about creating a table here called contact details. Now again, if I go right click, run, this will look like nothing's happened here, but what we can assume is that this has gone about creating a table for us. Now, a cheeky way for us to test, one that's not necessarily recommended in all instances, is if we run this again, we'll get an error. And that's because we're trying to create the same table over it twice. All right, so we're trying to create a second table within the same database, and it throws up an error. So we're pretty sure that there is something in here. So we've now gone about creating a database here, and we've created a table to go within that database. That's all that I'm going to use within this file here. The next stage that I want to do is I want to go about populating that same table there, the contact details. So to do that, I'm going to right click on my parent folder again up here and say new Python file. I'm going to create a file called dbpopulate. Now I'm going to end up copying out most of the code here from dbcreate. So I'm going to click here within create, and again, if you're using Visual Studio or Idle or anything else, you should be able to navigate between your files reasonably easily. I'm going to select everything here by hitting Control A, Control C, or right click copy, skip back here into dbpopulate and paste it all into there. Now, 2 parts to this, and both of them relate to the why do I bother doing this at all, and have a separate bit here called dbpopulate. Why not just do everything within one db file, one .py file here? Well, the reason for me is that I often end up making mistakes and want to go back and recreate certain things, and it's handy to have various pieces of code here ready to go. There's boilerplate code that I can say, oh, I want to create a new table, and I can just copy and paste this stuff over. So it's handy to have that stuff in case I do want to go and recreate it later on. It also means that I can now use this same content here, all of the stuff within these 3. I can delete everything else within it, and I can now really quickly go about adding some actual data to my table here, contact details. So how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to use a insert into contact details, and now I'm going to specify the various fields that I'm using. Now, even though I did create an ID field, I'm going to leave that one blank because you might remember that we made it a primary key, and we made it an integer that will auto increment. So if we don't specify that when we're inserting data into these other fields, it will automatically increment one up for us. So I'm going to say first name, surname, street address, and suburb, and I want to insert the following values. So again, just basic SQLite coding or SQL coding. I'm saying, hey, I want to insert into contact details table 1, 2, 3, 4 items, 4 fields for each record in this instance. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to create some dummy data here, and feel free to go ahead and enter any of your own dummy data here as long as it does follow the same format. And hopefully when you're done, it will look a little bit like that. Apologies for skipping ahead, but it's much more productive than you watching me type. So some important things to note here. I've got 4 items in each one of these. Each of them is specified within a quotation mark here, followed by a comma, and then the next item. So first name in each instance, followed by the surname, followed by the street address, followed by the suburb. Just note here as well that each item, each record, is here within a bracket with a comma at the end of each one of these records, except for the last one, and then we go into our usual connie.commit and connie.close. So let's see what this does now. I'm going to go right click, run db populate. Unusually we don't have any errors here. So we don't actually know if anything's happened within our database. So the way that we're going to do that is we're now going to go about querying our database. So we're going to query this table in particular. To do that, we're going to right click on student.ms, again the parent folder here, and go new Python file. And we're going to do db query, and I'm going to paste all of the same stuff in here again because it should still be on the clipboard. But this time what I'm going to do is within this c.execute in my trip quotation marks here, I'm now going to use a select statement. Select star from, what do we call this, contact details, done. Now importantly, when it comes to using SQLite within PyCharm, you'll note that if I go right click run, nothing actually happens here. And that's because, yes, I've gone about selecting it, but I haven't gone about then doing anything with it. So the way that I do that is I'm going to say student info, so it's creating a new variable, and I want it to get all the data, fetch all of the data from this select query and put it into this variable student.info. Now just a quick note on this, you can do fetch all, you can do fetch one, you can specify within fetch one which nth value it is, etc, etc. For now I'm just going to assume that we're just going to collect all of it. Now this should be as simple as, now I can say print student info. So now if I go right click, run db query, you'll see that I get all of my info here. Now this is done quite ugly, right? So each one of these records is here within, it's put it into a list and a tuple and whatnot. Even though that is quite ugly, a handy thing that we can do here is we can now do for student in student info, and we can print student. So this will make it a little bit better. There'll still be ugly parentheses and stuff around it, but this is a much nicer way for us to do this. So this is saying, hey, there's going to be multiple items within student info. For each one of those items, we're going to call it student, print that student in each instance. Now from there, we've gone about creating one database with one table with 3 records in it, and we can query it. We could sit here and spend the next few hours creating a really beautiful database, build some relationships and whatnot between it. We could go about creating an actual student management system, which would include much more detail than just this stuff here. You know, you would add parent contact details, any phone numbers, etc., etc. You would probably then add some other tables to do with academic data and blah, blah, blah. But in reality, for our purposes, if you can do this once in this sort of style, then I'm sure that you can do it multiple times. So instead, the next stage that we're going to do is we're going to go about pushing this data into a Flask web framework. So to do that, we're firstly going to close all these various files here because we aren't going to need them too much just now. I'm also going to minimize this just so I get a little bit more space just to keep things neat. I'm now going to go about creating another .py file. I'm going to right click on the parent folder student.ms, student_ms rather. I'm going to go new Python file. I'm going to create a file called app.py. Try to stick with app.py for now. This is going to be an empty file, and I'm going to start off by typing some of the following here. So in this instance, we're going to go about using Flask. So Flask, as I said before, is a micro framework for developing web apps. You'll see that as soon as I go about importing this, PyCharm community says, hey, why don't you go and buy PyCharm Professional? PyCharm Professional is excellent. And if you're going to be getting into using Flask a lot, it might be worth some dollars in order to get hold of it. We're not going to do this for now. We're just going to stick with the basic community edition. But if you do want to go down the professional route, it is really handy. It doesn't add heaps of additional functionality, but it is a few extra bits. It does a lot of this initial setup for us. As well as that, later on we're going to need to use our SQLite, so we're going to go about importing that. Now, in order to instantiate Flask, that is to make sure that we have an app here that's going to be run on a browser, we need to go about creating an app, and we're going to say that the app is going to be, if you like, a version of Flask. We'll just refer to it as that for now. Now, as well as that, what we need to do with creating something that will run within a browser is that we need to create a route for it. So route, this is going to be a URL. So we're going to leave this root one for now, but what we're also going to do is create a double route, which is going to be for both a slash and for a home. So what does this actually mean? This means that when we first run our app, it's going to take us to this root here, and whatever we put underneath here, so within this def, underneath this definition here, underneath this function, it's going to return whatever we say here when we go to that route. So let's just add a basic bit of information here. So we're going to say when you go to this URL, return hello world. Now at the very bottom of this, we need to add this part here. If name is equal to main app.run. So this should be pretty much the same again, whether you're doing Visual Studio Code or whatnot. But when we now go right click run app, it should give us some information here. And whereas before it would just do a basic printout, you'll see that it stays running. And if I were to click on this, you'll see it'll take me up into my default browser. And just at its basic route here, so without the slash, that's the same as including it and not including it, this is going to print hello world for me. So that's just within the browser there. Now if I hit stop and I change this to hello world again, why not, we'll add a couple of extra exclamations there, and then run this again. When I click on this, you'll see that I can edit it. If I were to click on this and go to the home, you'll see that it takes me to the same page. So that's the core of how Flask works, even to the extent where I can create other routes here, such as add, which is going to be one that we'll create later, which is for adding a student. Well, I can return, here is where we will add students. Should probably add to our database, but we'll do for now. When I hit stop and run, this is my home. This is my add student. So I can create as many routes as I want here. This is just my local host, but after that I can create as many routes here as I want, or just by using this decorator and adding a function to go with it. Just for neatness, we're going to ditch this one for now and get rid of that entirely, but we are going to keep a hold of this one. We're going to try to build this out a little bit. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn that off, so we're just going to stop it because otherwise it'll just keep running in the background. Now, rather than us needing to add all of this data here, it makes a lot more sense for us to be using HTML, so that then we can be making dynamic web pages, we can add whatever content we want in here, and instead of needing to make this one.py file huge, we can just change this to one HTML file. So what we want to do is we want to create a template. And we're going to do that by right-click on the parent folder here again, and instead of going new Python file as normal, we're going to say new directory. We're going to call this one templates. Make sure that you call that one templates. Within that, I'm going to go right click new, and in this case I am right clicking on templates, not on the parent folder, just note that. Right click new, HTML file, and I'm going to create a new HTML5 file called home. I'm just going to create some basic stuff here, and just call this here is my home page, and hit Ctrl S to save. So you'll see that I've got home.html and I've got app.py. So what I want to do now is I want to render this home page, this HTML, instead of just this basic stuff here. And what I do is I come up to the top here, and whereas I previously had from Flask import Flask, I now want to import another method here, another function here called render template. I'm going to ditch all of this stuff up as far as return. Now I'm going to type in return render template home.html. Make sure that you've got your quotation marks here. Well, now when I hit run on this and click on that, you'll see that it takes me this, and that this is different from these others. And that being because this time it's gone about rendering not just whatever static text I had, but this home.html. So now if I close that or turn off my local server here, a real benefit of us using HTML is it affords us a lot of opportunities with bolting in other add-ons and other bits. So I'm going to go back here to my browser, and this time I'm going to go and do a Google search for Get Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is a library of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript features that is really quick and easy for us to use. We're going to use this as our core method of building our user interface. The way that we use Bootstrap is we go to their website and we click on documentation. This will take us to an introduction page here. And if we scroll down, it'll give us, hey, here's a starter template. All right, so this stuff here. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this over the top of what we previously have here within HTML. Now, handily, they've got a copy to clipboard up here, so I'm going to use that. Click on that. Just note this is again here on the starter template on their introduction page here with documentation. I'm going to select everything here within home and ditch it, and then I'm going to paste Bootstrap in. So what we can do now when I hit run is when I click on this, you'll see that my font is now different from before, and that's usually a pretty good indicator that, hey, Bootstrap's working. So why use Bootstrap and what is it? Well, let's just start with a basic example. Up here under search, I'm going to type in the word jumbo, and it's going to do a quick search for Jumbotron. I'm going to go and click on that, and you'll see that it takes me to this stuff here. So the beautiful thing with Bootstrap is that once you have it installed, and installing it, I mean just as simple as copying all of this other stuff in here, they've got links to style sheets, etc. Everything that we put in the body here can just be regular HTML as before, but handily, if we just use this code here to start as start a boilerplate code, it makes it really pretty really quickly. Prime example, let's say I want to include this at the top of my page. Well, it's saying, hey, here's a Jumbotron, this is what it looks like, here's the code to build it. If I now go copy, and straight over the top of this Hello World H1, and ditch that and paste it in. Now when I hit stop and run that again, and return to here, you'll see that I now have this. Even more handily, because it's just built in straight HTML, it's always really easy to use. So where it says Hello World, well, I'm pretty sure that's going to be that part up here. So I can now go about customizing this. So I can replace Hello World with Student Management System 1.0. I can ditch all of this text here, and I can change it to something else that makes sense. Here is my SMS. And I might keep the buttons and stuff here, but I'm going to change this paragraph marker to it uses Python, Flask, Bootstrap, and SQLite. I'm going to leave that as learn more. So now I'm going to hit stop and run again, just by changing the static text in there. When I click on this, you'll see that I now have a relatively nice looking start. It's not beautiful, but it'll do us for now. So real benefit of using Bootstrap is that, hey, it's got all these pre-cooked components we can copy and paste in and just use as a starter. While we're here, it's worth pointing out two useful things. The first is that possibly the handiest shortcut key within PyCharm is to hold down Control-Alt-L, and this will format all of your, or re-indent everything so that it all actually makes a bit more sense to you, particularly when you're copying and pasting out. The other thing is that whereas before we might have been used to right-clicking on a .py file and hitting run, if you do that within home.html, no HTML will work all that well, right? You can't right-click run on it, and even if you can under certain circumstances, it will look ugly because it needs to be wrapped up here within this Flask stuff for it to actually look any decent whatsoever. So we now have our starter page here. The next thing that we want to do is we want to actually display all of this data, probably within a table, given that we're pulling content out of a database. Well, again, quite handily, if we come back here to Bootstrap and do a quick search for table, you'll see that it has an option here for table/tables. I'm just going to use, I might not use that one actually. I don't really want a dark theme, that'll make it look ugly. I might use this one here with our striped rows. So again, just look your way through all of these, find one that you think will suit your styling, or feel free to create your own, etc. Once you do find one that makes sense, it should just be as simple as, well, I'm going to take this code and then I can just go about adapting it. So I'm going to take it back here into my PyCharm, go Control-V and then go Control-Alt-L just to make it all a little bit neater. So now if I hit run and then go to my page, you'll see that I have my various data here. Now this is all just static data that came in with my Bootstrap. So what I want to do is I now want to make sure that this is actually displaying the data that is coming out of my SQLite table, right, out of my contact details table. So that's going to be a little bit of a trick here that we need to get right. the first thing that we're going to do, if you like, a preliminary to this, is to work out how we can pass variables from Flask here, from Python app.py, into our HTML code. So I'm going to hit stop up here, and I'm going to skip back here into app.py. So this is my home route here, and I'm just going to go about creating a example text. Here is my sample text. Use whatever variable you would like to be using there, just as long as you've got some text here. And what we want to do is we want to see if we can get this to be displayed here within home.html, preferably with some Bootstrap formatting. Well, render template accepts not just this initial argument of .html, it can also accept additional arguments. So I'm going to create example underscore text equals example underscore text. Now this part's really confusing when you first come across it, because you're wondering why it is that you've got two here, example text equals example text, right? It should just be fairly self-explanatory, and you'd think that this just becomes circular and it won't actually achieve anything. Note here though that the formatting is slightly different on this one. It's gone this sort of browny thing, this ugly color here. The reason is that it's recognized that, hey, I'm sending through a variable called example text to HTML. And I want it to be equal to this example text variable that I've got up here. Now I could rename this if I wanted to be EG text, and you'll see that it doesn't actually worry what the name of this is. The reason that I tend to keep it the same, example text, is because it's one less thing for you to think about, well, why is it example text here within Python, but EG text when we reach HTML? So just keep these the same for now, and we'll hopefully get the hang of that the further we go in. Now, what we're doing is we're passing in this variable example text. Let's skip over here to HTML. To do this, I'm just going to open up a basic paragraph tag here, and then I'm going to do open double squiggle bracket thing, and I'm going to create a line here, example text. So just note the convention here that I've got the space after the double squiggle bracket, name of the variable, another space, and another double squiggle bracket. So you've probably guessed, or hopefully guessed, what this would look like when you get to the other end. Here's my sample text. So you'll note that I don't actually have anywhere here within my HTML something that says here is my sample text. All that it's doing is it's pulling in whatever I write here back within Flask, back within Python. So what we can do is we can use this same principle, but instead of us passing through just some static text, we can pass through some SQL queries. Well, no, really the response to a SQL query. So what we're going to do is we're going to go about creating a contact details. We're going to go about creating another function here that is going to do a lot of what our DB query over here actually did in the first instance. All right, so we're going to go about recreating a lot of that using largely the same code, because we've already got SQLite up here. We've already got our database. It's been sitting there waiting patiently for us to use it again. So we're going to do the same as before, where we're going to say this, and we're also going to use the same method before as db locale is going to be equal to students.db, and within here we're going to say db locale. We're going to create a c is equal to connie.cursor, so that we have something where we can pass in execute. And within this, we're just going to do our same as before, 3 lines. We could probably get by without at the moment, but just to keep it neater. Select star from, and we call the table contact details. So previously we did all the same stuff, and you might have remembered that we needed to then go about adding a variable here, which would be student data is equal to c.fetchAll, and we would then go print student data. So this function here is going to do, again, pretty much exactly what this here is going to do, except that we're going to skip the what do you call that thing, the iteration for now. So here within that, we now have this print student data. Now if I were to run this, you'll see that nothing actually happens because I haven't actually called this query contact details at all yet. The reason is that when I do this, I don't actually want to print this data. What I want to do is I want to return it, and there's an important distinction here. When you print data, it's going to pump it down out here into our console. We actually don't want that. We want it to come into here, into this variable, which can then get passed here into our HTML. So instead of having static text here, what we can do is we can say example text is going to actually be equal to query contact details. Now, we're also not going to call this example text because that's going to get ugly. Instead, we're going to call it student data, and we're going to rename each instance where it occurred over there. So what this is going to do is we're going to create a new variable student data, which is going to be the result, whatever is returned from this function here, which as we know is selecting all of the data from contact details. Once that's done, it gets passed in from Flask to HTML as this variable called student data. Here within home, we're going to rename this student data. So that's there within our home.html, the last point, if you like, where it's going to get pushed out. Well, now when I hit play and hit go, you'll see that it's pulled in all of our data here out of SQL. So the next step that we want to do is we want to be making sure that this goes from being just static text here, just boring paragraph mark, here into our table. So for us to do that, we're obviously going to need to go, if I just minimize this and stop that, sorry, we're obviously going to need to do this in such a way so that it doesn't matter how many records come out of our database, it will create that many rows. So in this instance, if you're comfortable with programming, you'll know that this is going to require some iteration. Now we can use Python style iteration here within home.html, and the way that we do that is we say, we open a squiggle bracket, just one this time, with a percentage sign, and we say for student in student data, and then we close all this. We want to print student, and then we need to do something different from Python, an end for here. So we'll just see what this does when we go about playing it this time. You'll see that in this instance it's taking each student and it's putting it on a different line, and that's because back in here we're saying we're putting it within a for loop, and for each student within that student data, print just the student. Right, so that individual row. Now we can use this same principle when we go about creating rows. One last piece of this puzzle is that each of these items, if I skip back into here, you'll see that each of these is stored within a tuple here. Right? So each of these 5 pieces of data is stored within a tuple. Well, we can go about calling each one of those by doing something such as 0, and I might add at the end of this, student 1, double bracket. So what this is going to do is it's going to print the first item in that tuple, and then the second item in that tuple, just noting the 0 and 1. The 0th value is the first value. Now when I hit go, you'll see that it prints 1, David, 2, Johnny, and 3, Joni. So I can now use, again, this same principle to get this final idea of, I want to print each one of the rows, but then I also want to specify what data goes into each one of the cells. Now hopefully you're basically familiar with some core HTML, and you'll be comfortable with editing some of the data here. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to go about editing within the table head, and this first table row, the table head of each item here. So you'll see that that was a hashtag, and that's this bit here. So I want to name these. This will need to be first name, surname, and I'll need another one here for what other data did I have? I must have had first, surname, name, street address, and suburb. So I'm going to say ID. I'm going to make that first name. I'm going to make this surname. I'm going to make this street address, and I'm going to duplicate the line. If you're using PyCharm, you can do that with Control D, and then I'm going to create a suburb. And now when I hit stop and play, you'll see that I've now got this extra column here without any data added to it, so it kind of hates me at the moment, but we can sort that out in a moment. Now this here within our table body, well, these rows are the various ones that we want to create. We want to create one of these rows instead of one of these p tags. So we can start off by, just to make this a little bit neater, deleting the next row and the row after that until we just have one row here within within our table body. So what we now want to do is we want to say, well, each one of these, we want this to be ID. Again, this isn't going to work just for demo purposes. We want this to be first, this to be surname, etc. But we want it to use our data. So what we can do is we can just put our for loop for student in student data here on either side of the row. In fact, we should do it outside that row as well here, and we should do our end for outside that row too, so then we don't end up with otherwise that would have made things a little bit messy. So we're going to say that for each student in student data, well, for this one we want to output student 0. And this is going to give us the first item of data, which, as we saw before, is this item, the ID. Now, item number student 1 is going to be their first result. So I can say here, student 1, and that's going to give me their table. Their first name out of the table. I can put here, student 2, and again we can just duplicate some rows here, so then we can say student 3 and student 4. And now I'm going to come back here and I'm going to delete all of that stuff here that I didn't necessarily want to keep forever. So this is saying for each student in student data, create a row, and within that row have a header, right? So it's the column at the very far left with their student data, their ID rather, their first name, their surname, their street address, and their suburb. Now when I hit stop and run, I'll end up with this stuff here. Now the beautiful thing with this is that wouldn't have mattered how many rows of data I wanted to give it. If it had brought out 1,000, it would have gone and printed each one of those, simply because we have these lines here. Just getting your head around this notion of iteration has such outsized benefits, because you can then iterate through each one of these and display your data howsoever you want. So hopefully you've kept up with all of that. A lot of things covered here, and it's probably worth doing a quick recap. Create your database here. We then went about creating a table underneath that. Within that, we then populated it with a set of data. We then went and managed to query that, make sure that our data was actually there. We created a instance of Flask here to hold that data and present it. We used render template instead of just being able to just dump in raw text in here. We then used SQL here in order to retrieve data and then pass it in through to Flask, to then pass in through here to HTML, to then be able to iterate it. That's obviously quite a bit to get your head around. Takes quite a bit of time in order to perfect it. So it's probably a logical place to pause and then think about how you might go about expanding on that and using those skills in other circumstances.